this week's trending topic is this year's Academy Awards, which are again causing headlines for the fact that not a single female director was recognized in the Best Director category. And I will say we normally have a planning meeting about once a month where we kind of lay out the topics for the podcast for the month. And we'd had a different topic, but because of this particular development, we decided we wanted to move in this direction. And part of the reason was that is, Jonathan, you posted a number of things on Twitter, Facebook, where you took a pretty strong position on that. So why don't we start with that, kind of your position on this, and then I want to hear from Emma Kate also about her view of it. And I think we'll find some common ground, but we might have some differences of how we see this.
Well, so I love movies, as you guys all know, and I have a love-hate relationship with the Oscars, similar to Frank Gaskell, who's not here today. And like Frank Gaskell, the Oscars get it wrong more often than right. And so obviously it's a very personal and subjective criteria, but Little Women was probably in my top 2 or 3 films of the year. I really loved it that much because I think it encapsulated all the whole comprehensive craft of filmmaking. Editing, direction, acting performances. I really couldn't find anything that I thought was a flaw of the film. And knowing what movies were tracking to get nominated for Best Director, that it was really frustrating and disappointing to see Greta Gerwig get overlooked. Now, I can use, and other people can use, language that indicates like snub or that there is an active conspiracy, which I do not generally believe to be the case because people vote independently. But I do think that the Oscar nomination, specifically with Best Director, represents or highlights a larger institutional problem with that particular category, that one category of Best Director that is very insular with male directors, that it's very difficult for women to break into that nominating or voting block, and therefore you have this cycle that really continues to perpetuate male directors, and every now and then, and I emphasize every now and then, a female or a person of color will get nominated, and there just seems to be this element of patting themselves on the back that they're progressing, only to see a year or two later all of that advancement kind of gone to the wayside. So to me, it really is just a frustration, and it's really difficult for me to not believe that on some level there is institutional sexism at play.
Yeah, I find myself feeling frustrated just simply because, the Oscars likes to tout that they have changed, but in their 92 years, there's only been 5 females that have been nominated and only 1 who has won for director. And I hear the argument, and I want to be tactful to approach this because I guess my real question is, what are the quote-unquote criteria that makes this the film, the award worthy of the nominee? And it's kind of like, okay, so we're perpetuating the male narrative. That's what 2020 and the Oscars just in general feel like. We are perpetuating this male narrative where men are proud of men and the men's story, and there's not as much value placed on women. And I'm not saying that's true, and I know that's a little bit of a generalization, but that seems to be most of the time that's what happens. And so I'm glad Little Women is in there. But I don't know. It's just frustrating. So,
well, there's a lot of aspects to this, and I want to see if we can pick up as many as we can. But let me just give a little background on this. The Academy has about 8,200 members. In the past 4 years, they've added about 2,000 of those. So they've made a really big push in the last 3 to 4 years to add more persons of color and women in particular. And just to give you kind of the context for the Academy itself, and then we'll talk about the Directors Guild in particular. Right now, only 31% of the Academy is female. So, and that, by the way, is up by a considerable amount over the past 5 years. So almost
that's progress.
It is progress, right? Half of the new members that they added were female. So it brings the number up to 31%. 16% of the Academy are persons of color. And again, 38% of the new members were people of color. So if we look at the U.S. population, 51% obviously females, 23% persons of color. If we look at 13% of the U.S. population is black. But here we go. 85% of film directors, feature film directors, are male. In 2018, only 5% of the top 100 grossing films were made by female directors. In 2019, that number was up to 11%, and I'm saying up to 11%. Like that's a big, yeah, I know, big progress. So here's the last piece of this that's important. The Directors Guild is who nominates the directors, the Oscar nominations for directing. So and they will not disclose the number of the demographics for that guild.
I wonder why.
Yeah, right. And we know why, because I mean, if we just track like what percent of film directors are male, 85%, it's gonna track accordingly or worse. And there's several rules for inclusion in that guild. One of them is they have to have 2 directorial credits in the past 10 years. So again, the chances of a female getting into that guild and so on. So there's some stuff baked into the bias right from the beginning, right? You've got a guild that's predominantly by a mile male dominated, but you also, even more importantly, you have men who are making the lion's share of films. Men are making 90% of feature films. So here's the question that I pose. I don't disagree with the premise that you've laid out and that there's institutional bias and that the Academy needs to continue to reform. But what do you do given that right now? In other words, if out of the pool of movies, 90% of them are made by men, 10%, 11% are made by women, and then who gets to be, the feature films that get to be nominated? To me, the issue is at the industry level and not at the Academy level more so. Do you know what I'm trying to say? In other words, I think the issue is more about that it's an industry-wide problem of women not having access to making feature films than it is, because when I look at the list of who was nominated, I would also put Little Women on my short list. It's one of the 10 best films of the year. But would you bump Quentin Tarantino, Todd Phillips, Bong Joon-ho, Martin Scorsese, Sam Mendes? Would you bump those guys?
I would easily. Oh, go ahead.
No, well, I mean, I was just going to say, there's no question that these are great films, but and I'm not disagreeing with you, Dave, but I want to be clear that, okay, so fine, this is an industry level issue. Let's go with that. The Academy is pretty much singularly, from my perspective, one of the most powerful institutions that has the potential to infiltrate that community and say, hey, we're not okay with this. Why are we not pushing this more? And so, I see what you're saying, but at the same time, I'm also like, if we want to make some progress, we really have to implore these different institutions to advocate for it.
I don't disagree with that. But I'm saying now when it comes down to okay, this is the slate of who got given that hand, then here's the slate of people. Because I want to bring up the Stephen King quote in a second that he's gotten some heat for. But Jonathan, you said you would bump somebody.
Well, I would easily bump Todd Phillips from that list for Joker, because it really should be a second nomination for Martin Scorsese, since most of that film is really either homage or pastiche from Taxi Driver and King of Comedy. So that movie I don't place anywhere near the same prestige as Little Women and the work that Greta Gerwig did, especially with the writing and the editing and how she modernized it and made it non-linear, that I think really works in the film's narrative favor. And I think that really shows the mastery of her craftsmanship. That to me, it goes back to her direction. So that would easily be one person. I may also put Martin Scorsese. I don't want to bump anybody off, but I feel like there was not 1 minute of Little Women where I was bored or disinterested. I think Martin Scorsese made a 3.5-hour movie to drive a central theme or point that he could have done in easily an hour or more, or an hour trimmed off of it. But that's just personal opinion. To me, it's really more about, okay, it is more about an industry problem. But we've talked about this many years of what really awards and specifically the Oscars represent. They represent credibility. They open doors. So to me, it's a way, and those studios, they love them some Oscars. So the idea of using that as a way to incentivize more films greenlit that are driven by women directors, I think you start with that because it incentivizes studios. The idea of winning an award can generate more greenlit projects. And I have a couple ideas and thoughts. One would just simply be make an exception for the Directors Guild where women only need one feature film versus two, because here is a statistic coming out of a report from the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. The study found that female directors typically have shorter careers than men. On average, they start later and end earlier than men. In their study, 84% of women never directed a second movie. And so if they need 2 feature films to be eligible for inclusion, right there, they already have a system that is at great disadvantage for them. So give women a 1 feature film credit that they're eligible to join into the guild. That would be one thing that honestly I think would be a pretty universally lauded and acceptable.
And I will say there is provision for that. There is exceptions for the Directors Guild.
The second thing I would recommend is increase the number of Best Director nominees the same way we did Best Feature Films. So if a movie is viewed as high quality as to get a Best Picture nomination, how can you exclude or have to decide which directors deserve it more than others? There is a strong chance none of these are. These only scratch the surface, but it's really about how do we start change. That I feel very confident that Greta Gerwig would have gotten a nomination for Little Women if there could have been up to 8 or 9 director nominees.
For sure.
So that would be
I do too.
A second. The third is very controversial. I actually was on a Facebook chat in a film club about this, and I got a lot of pushback, which is fine. But I'd be open in opening a second director category for Best Female Director in the same way that we do with acting for women, in the same way we have Best International Film or Best Animated Film. Nobody's going to say that there is as many animated films as feature films, but getting a Oscar nomination incentivizes film companies to produce and generate those products. The biggest argument people would make, or that I heard on this Facebook chat, was that it devalues the award or it diminishes women. And my argument would be, well, let the women that are nominated and get that award, let them decide if they feel diminished or see how it helps the longevity and credibility of their career. I don't know if that's for me to argue. I don't know if a Best Supporting Actor or Actress award diminishes their accomplishments. To me, it's really more of change that people find ways to discredit it versus it's always about evolving and changing. And if we need to do something to incentivize the Academy to greenlight or to champion women filmmakers, I'm open to any suggestion. I'd rather include and add rather than have a zero sum where you really take away from other people that may feel like they are deserving of the nomination.
And I see that. I think one of the things that I struggle with, and I know Dave, and maybe I'm kind of jumping around here, but Dave mentioned the Stephen King quote. So maybe I'll hold that one thought for later.
You can go. Yep.
Well, because again, what did he say again? Stephen King quoted.
Well, he basically said, "I don't consider diversity in art," and I think my understanding of that quote, the meaning of it is, we should look at whether this particular film or this particular act of, directing or whatever is the thing that is the best, and not whether it was produced by a woman or a person of color or so on. That was took to be his meaning.
Which, again, I see, but the problem is art is in the eye of the beholder. So I might look at a piece of paper and say, oh, that is beautiful. And you guys might also view it that way. However, if we had somebody from a completely different location of the country, they would say, what are you guys talking about? It's a piece of paper. Get a grip. So it's everything. Our perception is our own perception. It's based on our reality, our biases, our beliefs. And okay, so fine. Men might view one film as being great because, oh, they can relate to the male storyline, as opposed to a male viewing Little Women. They're like, this means nothing to me. So then they don't interpret that as art. And that's just an example. But I just get frustrated because, I'm kind of with Hedderly, where I see why people are upset over this idea. I mean, I think it's kind of a great idea if we had a best male and best female directors category, because the point is it opens the door for women to have more opportunities to create potential equal pay in that industry. And so, I'm kind of in Hedderly's camp, which is surprising because normally I'm not always in that camp.
So let me extend that idea a little bit that we just brought up, and there's obviously a ton to talk about still, but what I agree with your premise that art is in the eye of the beholder. It's subjective. We all have our own biases, and that certainly, there were stories that came out before the Oscar nominations about how male critics tended to not like Little Women as much as female critics, and sort of made the point of that. But given that, what apart from what we're talking about, which we need more representation, for more balance in the academy, more representation in that industry, what do you do given that? Like, do you would we say, well, there has to be a female, short of Hedderly's recommendation of a separate category, but there has to be female representation, or there has to be a person of color nominated, or like short of those other steps? How do you think about that?
I mean, I'll be honest and say I don't think there has to be a separate category. And in some ways, I really get the idea of, wow, okay, if we create this separate category, that what does that say? Like we're not able to contend and fight with the men, so to speak, to create great art. But at the same time, I don't know. The whole thing is it's a system that has so many issues. And it's just like our country right now. We have a lot of issues. We don't know how to solve some of these problems because it's not just a clean-cut, simple answer. It's something that has to evolve over time. And it's better to try something like Hedderly's suggestion. And if it blows up in our face, then so be it. But at least we are making efforts and we are putting forth ideas versus just sitting twiddling our thumbs and saying, we don't like this. Why are we – I don't know. I think any movement, if there is intention and thought put behind it, is positive.
Jonathan, any other thoughts about that idea?
Well, I think that the powers that be that are really going to move the needle is either actors and women and people of color standing up into the industry, or the movie-going population boycotting or making other statements. Like there was a movement within Hollywood where they were asking for actors and actresses to commit to, within a certain period of time, signing on to a project that was directed by a woman to kind of help, again, kind of increase opportunity and viability. And when there is a film that is directed by a woman that has a major star attached to it, that's going to put more eyes on that project and get more support. So that's one thing. The other is boycotting, and I think that all of those are perfectly acceptable ways for really just to remind and keep this at the forefront of a conversation that this isn't going away, because we don't see it going away. And even though there may be a sizable population of the entertainment industry that leans liberal, that there is still a lot of discrepancy in how their practices and representation is very incongruent with that belief system or that political slant. I'm always more of the mindset of generating more opportunities rather than exclusion. So the idea of like there has to be one female director, to me, there's more downside and drawback than I think there's upside. I think increasing the pool of nominees or in some ways adding a separate category, because it's not about their value and worth as a filmmaker. It's really about the institutional structure that says, no, they aren't competing when it comes to recognition. They're not competing with equal number of films and products. That if you had just a best actor category, I truly believe that predominantly only men would be nominated. And so I don't think having a best female or actress category diminishes their craft. It just gives them an opportunity to be recognized for it in a predominantly male industry.
A couple of comments on that. You did say that the industry tends to skew liberal, and that's generally true. But I will say many of the producers tend to be conservative business people. And the producers are the people that have the money, that make the hires, and so on. So that's something that I think we often don't consider as well. But I want to give a little bit of props to the Academy for the last few years, the initiatives that they have taken. They are taking it seriously. I don't think change happens in this sort of landslide moment. But they've taken steps. In the past 3-4 years, they've added 2,000 members where the gender and the racial balance is much better. They're moving in the right direction. But, to be very honest, if we're looking at just the country and demographics of where things are going, they will have no choice. The average age, if the median age for white people right now in our country is 57, for Asians, it's 29. For black,
and we look even younger.
Yeah, for black folks it's 27. For Hispanics it's 11. So there's no question that the face of the country is changing, and that's going to have to show up in not only racially but also what's happening culturally with the gender balance. I want to wrap up by just saying there are a number of female directors who put out some great work this year. I just want to recognize a few of them. Lulu Wang from The Farewell, Laureen Safaria, who directed Hustlers with Jennifer Lopez, Celine Sciamma, Portrait of a Lady on Fire. One of my favorite movies of the year was Alma Harrell's Honey Boy, Melinda Matsoukas' Queen and Slim, and Mariel Heller, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, among others. So there was some good work for women in the directing field, certainly enough to nominate a good number of women if there was either the opportunity for that. So opportunity beyond what the current structure allows, I guess that's the best way to say it. But good conversation, and we can kind of talk this through as the Oscar season continues. But we're going to wrap this up, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. I'm Dave Verhagen here in Nashville, signing off for Emma Kate Wright, Jonathan Hedderly, and Charlotte. And tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.